The Ukraine-Russia NATO military operation is intensifying. If Canada sends troops, a draft may be required. Don't you think it's interesting that the federal government wants access to health records? Perhaps you should call your premier.
Disruptive.
Weird thing to happen. But take a look at this. This is from Polling Canada. They collected this data from Angus Reid and says mandatory military service for young Canadians is unpopular, while other forms hold strong support among young Canadians. So they're debating whether or not, and I know other countries do this, and they're asking Canadians in the survey if they support a short-term service for national defense. And there is a strong disagreement. You can see here. Let's make it a bit bigger here. Support minus oppose each type of mandatory service. So there's strong disagreement with military service. You can see there minus 8% male and 39 minus for female. But there's strong support for other sectors, which is kind of interesting. That's kind of interesting. Which led to this article here from CTV News. Survey suggests Canadians are open to mandatory service for those under 30 years of age, as long as it's not military. So, it's a bit conflicting when they release a survey like that, because people assume that that leads to military service, and we know that military service in this country tend to get the brown end of the stick, that they're not fairly represented, they are not respected for their services, and they get bombasted with warfare that they did not enlist to, that they're serving the needs of, the oligarchy, NATO, military-industrial complex, that's not actually defending them or the country in particular. But as long as it's not military, I kind of have to actually agree with this. I kind of have to actually agree with this survey. I remember a time in high school, and I think they still have in high school, it's been a while, that you're required, in order to graduate from a high school in Canada, particularly in Ontario, that you had to have a certain amount of volunteer hours, that you had to enlist somewhere to help serve people or volunteer somewhere. You track down your hours and record them, and you had to, I think it was 40 hours was the minimum requirement for you to graduate, and that was to encourage people to go out, get some skills, interact with the general community, and give back to your fellow people. So if they do it in high school, I don't see it being a problem elsewhere. But let's see where this article goes, and you'll be the judge of it. So, a recent survey suggests many Canadians are open to the idea of serving their country in some way, even if it's mandatory. However, many aren't keen on the idea of military service, favoring alternative civilian areas like public health or environmental support. The Angus Reid survey, released Sunday, found that Canadians are in favor of the idea of mandatory civilian service, which would entail 1 year of time donated for those younger than 30 years of age. In recent years, Germany, France, Norway, and other countries have followed this model of service, the survey says. The survey found that about 7 in 10 respondents support 1 year of mandatory time donated in the fields of civilian protection, which includes disaster response, emergency management, and firefighting, public health support in hospitals and elderly care, environmental support with Parks Canada or conservation efforts, or youth services such as tutoring and after-school programs. However, it came to mandatory military service, the overall results were more diverse, with 43% in support of it and 44% opposing it. When it came down to the specific type of mandatory service, they would choose, if they had to pick, 3 and 5, 59% say civilian service, while 1 and 5% say military service. 1 and 8 said neither. There has been some discourse in recent years about how to boost military enrollment, especially as the armed forces experiences a shortfall in personal recruitment. So this is kind of why they're starting to bring up this conversation, because they know that recruitment in the military is dropping. And particularly after they fired a lot of their own troops and servicemen and women with COVID. They fired people for not getting jabbed with an experimental vaccine that's proven safe and effective, according to YouTube. They fired them. They gave them a discharge. So those people that were active and engaging within the military were forced to leave because they wouldn't comply with big pharmaceuticals, or they wouldn't comply with wokeism, or they wouldn't comply with the agenda of corporations that has taken over the line of defense. So all these people that are enlisting to think that they're serving the country are actually enlisting to serve whatever corporation or private investor and donor that bought out the Canadian military. And we're not actually investing into our defense. And as I stated, as a healthy compromise to the situation, that if we really cared about defense and cared about our troops and the people that serve in the military, why are we insisting on throwing them into other countries to aid and assist in just absolute devastating warfare for private equity and companies to profit off of, when we can bring the troops back home and actually help defend things like the border? That would actually be beneficial for so many reasons. It's beneficial for the service people in the military. It's beneficial for defense of our nation. It'd be cheaper to have troops stationed within our own country. And it actually is a means of defense, as opposed to going overseas and blowing up parts of the world, because that doesn't actually help our defense. So the Angus Reid survey found that mandatory military service appeared to be favored more by men, particularly from older generations. The largest group to support this idea was men over 60 at 39%, as they opposed to only 2% of women in that same age group. Support for mandatory military service among men aged 18 to 29 was negative, as well as for every other age group for women. The survey comes after a recent announcement by Prime Minister Mark Carney of an increase in pay for members of the Canadian Armed Forces. So they're desperate for people. They're desperate for people. And this is kind of their way to incentivize people to enlist into the armed forces. And I'm sure more and more people would actually consider the armed forces if they knew that they were getting treated well and respected, as they're putting their lives at risk to defend the country. But over time, and after many years, particularly with COVID and with the Ukraine war, with Israel, with all of our endless warfare that a peacekeeping nation is a part of, keep that in mind. We're a peacekeeping nation. We're not supposed to be engaging in this much radical warfare, but we're consistently doing it over the past how many years. It's kind of discouraging people from that. Because why would I go overseas and shoot down innocent civilians of another country to serve the needs of a corporation or a foreign nation that doesn't help defend the people back here at home and jeopardizes our national security? We're creating more enemies in the process of doing this. So how is that defending the country? How is that defending the country if we're over in Ukraine, attacking Russia for the interests of NATO? How is that defending the people of Canada? How is it defending the people of Canada that you're assisting the IDF in a genocide? How is that going to defend people here in Canada, where obviously the biggest need of defense is the border? And that's why I say that a simple solution, I think a fair compromise, is bring the troops back home and get them towards the border so they can actually defend the illegal invasion of our country, so they can actually crack down on human trafficking, drug smuggling, because border security is desperate. They're extremely desperate to crack down on people, but our federal government doesn't respect them the same way they don't respect the Canadian Armed Forces. So here's Polling Canada again from Angus Reid. Canadians strongly prefer a mandatory national service be more civilian than military if it had to exist. So I can understand that. And maybe, even though I think it's kind of overreaching that you are forced to put yourself into a civilian volunteer position, that they have to mandate people for that, it wouldn't be the worst thing. And like I said, you already kind of have to do that when you're in school as a teenager. In high school, in order to graduate, you have to put yourself into a volunteering position and obtain so many hours. So there are some good out of this, but I don't think that mandating people, especially after the heinous acts, after the insider look, after seeing how the federal government just completely decimated against its own members within the armed services with mandates and, cutting off their abilities and just firing them off for not complying with these heinous protocols. It's just discouraging more people. So if you want to incentivize more people coming in, then make sure that you actually respect them for their quality of service. Actually respect them, because these are people that are putting themselves on the front lines and sacrificing their livelihoods for you, for the country. So let's actually honor them and respect them properly by making sure that we defend them the same way they're defending us. That should be a simple measure. But of course, in Canada, when we have a war-hungry politician or we have bloodthirsty capitalists that want to profiteer off of warfare and defense spending, I mean, look at Canada right now. They just spend an $18 billion contract to manufacture more weapons to Israel. And we're supposed to be a peacekeeping nation. Just keep that in mind. We didn't go into Iraq in the early 2000s. And then all of a sudden we became this war-hungry, bloodthirsty, this tyrannical mess. We used to laugh in the United States for being that. And now we become that. So this guy, I think his name is Gidio. Is that how you say it? Gidio Marazzo. Says, if you people really believe any of these young people have any allegiance to what's being done to them in the name of boomer mania, you aren't paying attention to employment numbers. They are leaving the country in droves. Go talk to them daily like I do. Don't survey them. So that could be another thing that's discouraging younger people from putting their front lines on for, military service and defending the country, because the country is unfortunately not defending them. That the Canadian government is not putting Canadians first. They're putting themselves first, They're putting the billionaires first. They're putting Israel first. They're putting Ukraine first. They're putting NATO first. But not Canadians. Not the people that are actually paying tax dollars for the Canadian government to function. And a lot of people are being discouraged from even staying in Canada and are looking elsewhere. Which I can't really blame them. I can't really blame them. When the average rent price is skyrocketing, when you can't, fulfill your basic needs, when simple errands like grocery shopping become expensive, and 2 million people a month are lining up at food banks, I can't blame them for wanting to get out. I can't blame them. But here's the Canadian government resorting to another measure, which is very controversial, saying non-permanent resident and non-Canadian citizens can now serve in the Canadian Armed Forces as of today. Holy effing S. We have officially lost the country. So they're desperate that they're asking people about mandatory service, like a draft, but also now they're bringing in migrants to reach recruitment levels. Now, this is why they do this in the United States. They've done this in the United States, which is why the United States has an open door policy when it comes to immigration. And they're just flooding the country with newcomers because they want new recruiters into the military. Which, don't you think that's kind of controversial? Don't you think that's conflicting? When you have people from countries, war-torn areas that we have decimated, we have caused, and now you're bringing them in saying, hey, join our army. Do you think that's going to go well? Do you think that's going to go well? But here's one of the recruiters here from the armed forces explaining that now you don't have to be a resident of Canada to serve in the Canadian military.
Our focus is transformation and mobilization are the two key words that I use to describe the approach that we have at the moment. Of course, modernization means more than just changing how we recruit, but it also means changing who we recruit.
With support from the Vice Chief of Defense Staff and government partners, we are challenging outdated policies and practices to simplify security process for applicants with ties to other countries. Therefore, most applicants, included permanent resident, can begin basic training after receiving the reliability status clearance. Just recently, we have enrolled our 455th permanent resident, so great success. To build on how we recruit and ensuring that we don't unnecessarily screen good candidates out, we are modernizing our medical standard by reviewing our military common medical standards and aligning them with our new universality of service policy. This will give us more flexibility to recognize that people with low-risk medical condition may still serve fully in the Canadian Armed Forces. Right now.
So, are you going to apologize then to all the soldiers that you fired, that you kicked off the forces because they wouldn't comply to an experimental vaccine? Is that under your review? Is that part of the medical transformation of the armed forces? That would do a lot. That would actually show solidarity and support for troops. Wouldn't you think? You're supporting the troops that got fired against their will, because of a mandate put on them by the federal government, the same federal government that will continuously say they support the troops, but then go behind their back. Is that part of the agenda? Because I think I would hope that would gain more support for people if we actually saw that. If we actually saw some real instance of support for the men and women that suit up and enlist into these positions where they're ultimately sacrificing their lives. You would think, but we'll have to see.
Now, 26.4% of newly enrolled Canadian Armed Forces members identify as racialized Canadians. 18% are women, and 5.2% identify as Indigenous. To succeed, we must continue to tap on all Canadians from all communities who want to serve.
Candidates without high-risk foreign implications now complete an initial reliability status check before enrollment. That is to say, they are now enrolled under the same process as Canadian citizens who do not possess high-risk foreign implications. We've analyzed our processes and realized that the Canadian Forces Aptitude Test was not in line with industry best practices and served as a barrier to enrollment. Instead, we've introduced a Scored Employment Application Form, or SEAF, which evaluates essential qualities of personal and organizational success, including academic results, qualifications, work experience, extracurricular activities, or other life achievements.
With a modernized common enrollment medical standard, we are adding a third group, fit to the task, which means that while the applicant has medical employment limitations, for example, requires daily access to medications, those limitations do not represent a medical contraindication to attend basic training. The applicant must also meet universality of service requirements and medical standards for their desired military occupation.
So they're cutting back the red tape. They're clearly in a position where they're desperate for people. And, you know, it's just crazy that they're going around and just putting themselves and jeopardize themselves to go around just simply having strong enough Canadians to actually defend the country, which is kind of the whole point of having armed forces to begin with. They're going around that to get migrants who barely have a month within this country to enlist up into this army for the sole purpose of serving the oligarch billionaire class. Because all this is going to lead to is just more foot soldiers to go fight in the front lines of manufactured wars overseas and less defense of our country. And just to show an example of this is back in February, but it's stuff like this that's discouraging people. So remember when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister and he said sending Canadian troops to Ukraine is on the table, under pressure peace deal, according to Trudeau. So that's your Prime Minister telling soldiers that they're going to be at the front lines of the Ukraine war as they're wiping out populations of Ukrainians. The average Ukrainian soldier now is up to 60 because everyone from 18 and older got wiped out from this manufactured war. And now they want to bring in Canadian troops to go and defend another country. Not defending us, not defending our borders, not defending us when if something happens to us, God forbid. But we're going to send troops over to another country on the other side of the world to serve their interests and NATO to go after Russia. How do you think that's going to go well? How do you think that's going to go well for our country? That you're sending mercenaries over there to further aggress Russia, to attack Russia. Do you think they're going to take it lightly? Do you think they're going to take it lightly that Canadians are actively going after Russia and it's going to make things safer? Do you think it's going to make it safer to engage more into this outrageous warfare when more and more people are starting to realize that this war is completely manufactured, that it needs to stop immediately? That's why they voted someone like Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is not committed to that. Donald Trump is continuing on this war. because people are starting to realize that Donald Trump was never going to resolve it. He said he was going to resolve it in 24 hours, but it's out of his reach because this is all in part with BlackRock and NATO and Vanguard and the bankers and weapons manufacturers, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, all of them are heavily invested into the manufacture of warfare. So I don't blame people. I don't blame people from turning their back on the Canadian military when Canadian soldiers who are actively engaged right now are being disrespected by the federal government, by our own ministers that continuously talk about how they're supporting the troops. We need to bring more people in. We need strong defense. You're not defending anyone within the country. You're not even defending the people serving. It's an absolute joke. It's an absolute catastrophe. Here's this woman, Tanglefoot. Tanglefoot Dailies. That's an interesting handle. She states Canada hasn't been in a draft since the World War. The Ukraine-Russia-NATO military operation is intensifying. If Canada sends troops, a draft may be required. So, as Ukraine is losing men and women left, right, and center, don't you think it's kind of a coincidence that all of a sudden Canada is now hinting the idea of mandatory service for youngsters, our Canadians, particularly over there? You think we'd be in the interest of resolution and negotiation. But of course, as Julian Assange reminds us, none of these wars are about resolution. They're not about finding a solution to these conflicts. It's about keeping it going as long as it takes so that the war profiteers make more money off the death and disparity of humanity. Don't you think it's interesting that the federal government wants access to health records? Perhaps you should call your premier. So she has a little PSA video to talk about it.
So a friend said to me while we were talking about the federal healthcare payment, she said, you know, it's really interesting, isn't it, that it coincides with digital ID and the sharing of health information. I said, how so do you think? She says, well, it looks like we are probably going to have, possibly a war opportunity and maybe a draft opportunity. And she said, what a better way to make sure that kids that are war age can't deke out of it by saying, yeah, I've got a health concern. Because the federal government will have access to all these records. And yeah, you might say, oh, it's going to take time to get the federal government records. Well, they can rush, 18 to 38. Rush those ones to them to make sure that they are fit and healthy for service. So if you have kids that are that age, or you will fall in that age, and maybe you want to think twice about giving the federal government quick and easy access to your medical records.
So that can be a bit disturbing. And that is a possibility that as they're incorporating digital IDs and access of information and data collecting on everybody, that this mandate program, let's say, could eventually just lead up to a mandatory draft. And they can just exploit people because now you have all the information on them. You have their age. You have their medical records. You know exactly if they're capable enough to go fight for these wars. And since they're continuously making more wars happen and not coming to resolution and coming to the realization that constantly having warfare overseas is ridiculous. It's costing lives. It's costing devastation. It's not good for the planet. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for anybody. All it does is make profits off the death and disparity and blood of others. that's not defending our country one bit, they're now going to extort their power using digital ID, using AI and data collection to then tell people, yeah, you're going to enlist. But they can never tell people it's a draft, because if people actually knew that it was a draft, there would be protests. There'd be protests all across the country. Just like how the United States will never say they're going to admit a draft, but they will make it impossible for you to pay off student loans, make it impossible for you to pay off medical records. They'll make it financially burden for you to not enlist, which is why they go to poor communities. We knew this from Michael Moore's documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11. They'll go to the poorest communities and they'll recruit people with financial debts. They'll recruit people without a college degree. They'll recruit people that can't get anywhere elsewhere. So they're going to sacrifice them to the machine. And I just find it hilarious that you never see recruiters in, say, Beverly Hills or Malibu or the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard. But you're telling me rich kids that have the ability to afford advanced healthcare, they're not equipped to go into warfare? They're probably the most healthiest out of all of them. But no, they'll never fight a war. You'll never see Trudeau's kids fighting a war. You'll never see Mark Carney's kid fighting a war. But they'll go after you. They'll go after you. They'll sacrifice you to the machine to get profit off of you with death and disparity and making your life miserable, costing your life in this heinous warfare, but also jeopardizing the national defense of our country. So that's going to turn people away. If it was just simple volunteer service like healthcare and senior citizen help, or volunteering your library, then I can maybe agree with this. I can maybe agree with that. But now you understand why people are turning their way from military service, knowing stuff like this, knowing that this is happening to them. And do you want your youngsters, do you want your kids to fight more wars, devastating wars that probably your parents or your ancestors or your grandparents fought in many wars, hoping that it would end all these catastrophes? Do you really want it to happen to them? Or do you want life to flourish in this country?